Welcome to the Snapshots podcast, hosted and run by the Global Health Working Group as part of the British International Studies Association. This podcast gathers the personal insights and interests of global health practitioners through conversations with those at its cutting edge. My name is Christopher Long, co-convener of the BISA Global Health Working Group, Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Sussex, and the host and production manager of this podcast. This episode, we are speaking with Dr. Nicholas Thomas, Associate Professor at City University, Hong Kong. Welcome to the Snapshots podcast.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. So, just to begin with then, so what sparked your interest working in global health?
Well, I'd come up to Hong Kong working on a consultancy for the Hong Kong government that was tied to the University of Hong Kong at the time. And that was a couple of years before SARS broke out. And so when SARS broke out, our group was tasked with looking at what Chinese policymakers were doing and what Southeast Asian policymakers were doing in response to SARS, and then to sort of put together briefings for the Hong Kong government and get them to sort of give them some ideas as to how we might move forward. And that was a pretty intense period. It was also, living through SARS here was also one of the really interesting times. Looking back on it, it was a little bit scary. I was actually running a conference on health at the time, and all of a sudden SARS breaks out and all the people is asking questions, what's going on? What does it all mean? And so that sort of got me going. And then later on that year, we had bird flu as well that broke out. And again, the team was asked to do some strategic analyses of what we should be looking at, what the Hong Kong government should be looking at. And it was really working on both SARS and then bird flu quite close together. And of course, being here in Hong Kong, which is really a hub for so many diseases that circulate around the world and so many new diseases sort of pop their heads up, that it just sort of was something I eventually sort of fell into. My other great love is Chinese foreign policy and Chinese politics. And I used to live there in China and in Taiwan. And again, the sort of dovetailed quite nicely with what was going on with global health. So I was actually able to go into the country and ask people and talk to people as to sort of see what was happening. So it sort of drew together a whole lot of disparate strands under sort of some interesting ideas as to what it means to be healthy, what it means to be secure, and how do people act or behave when there are threats like there are with pandemics that we see at the moment.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it seems like SARS and some early 2000s of the 2000s disease outbreaks have been some really key moments in this field of global health. So what are some of the key issues and questions that you've kind of investigated in this area of kind of global health and foreign policy?
Well, beyond the whole, beyond the issue of SARS and bird flu, which I worked on quite a while ago, I have sort of a bit of an affinity with securitization theory and theories of governance. So I've done a lot of work looking at how states securitize health. But also, just before before COVID rather was breaking out, I was doing work on antimicrobial resistance, which I still think is one of the ones we need to be paying attention to. Maybe we can chat about that later. But certainly in this part of the world, where you've got new genes that confer resistance to antibiotics coming out of both China and India, and sort of Asia being the hub that it is, getting these genes appearing. Working out how AMR sort of then fits into this matrix as to how we should respond to novel health threats was one of the ones I was working on before COVID, and certainly one of the ones I want to return to. But at the moment, I'm about to run a really cool survey looking at trust in China and how perceptions of trust in different areas have shaped people's social responses and social acceptance of different government policies. So we're just sort of doing the final translation on that survey now. And we'll be looking at trust in government, trust in doctors and healthcare providers, trust in people in the communities. It's a nationwide panel survey. And then we'll be looking at how that, as sort of how those clusters of trust impact upon people's acceptance of health policies, and also how that changes their perceptions of vaccines and vaccine utility. And it's kind of a cool project because no one's done it yet in China. I mean, we see these trust surveys everywhere else, but China's a bit of a black box for running these sorts of surveys. So I'm working with a colleague who works over the border in Guangdong, and we're sort of working on this project together. And I'm quite excited to see how that sort of goes. And if it goes well, then we'll look at spilling it over maybe here into Hong Kong, and then maybe other places like Taiwan, for example. We just have to sort of wait and see.
Great.
So,
yeah. Could you just explain for those who may not be too familiar what you mean by kind of securitization theory, and then how that does or maybe doesn't kind of link to this new project around trust that you're working on now?
They're a little bit well, I say they're divergent. They're a little bit similar as well in an unexpected way. So securitization is basically this idea that there is a threat which is identified as an existential threat. Someone identifies it as that within a speech act. People accept that. You have a shift into emergency mode with new resources, new policies being provided. Those policies are enacted. And then, according to theory at least, fingers crossed, those new policies allow us to actually then resolve the threat and we return to politics as normal. One of the theoretical bases for the trust project actually draws upon the second stage of securitization theory. So securitization theory, the second stage is audience acceptance. And not a lot of work theoretically has been done on unpacking what audience acceptance actually means. Is it that the people will simply willingly accept? Is it that a majority will accept wholeheartedly or partially? What are the parameters here? And so one of the rationales for the study that we put forward to the funding body was, if people are going to say that they agree with the leaders that, yes, COVID in this particular case is a threat, then what happens? Does that acceptance stay the same all the way through the process of dealing with the threat? Does it vary up and down? If it varies downwards, what implications does that have for the leadership's abilities to actually carry out novel policy agendas? If it goes higher, does that mean the leadership has greater policy entrepreneurship, policy capacity to introduce new policies? So that's sort of the overlap between trust and securitization. And I do think it's important. I mean, we're very much locating the study within the trust literature, but it does speak, especially when you're looking at this at a population level, how much do the people trust any government when they're dealing with the threat? And we see it not just in China, but all around the world. You know, some people might start off as skeptical, and then all of a sudden the threat really comes there. So yes, we trust more. And then it sort of gets better, and people seem to drop in trust almost within the surveys and in terms of their adherence to new policies. So trying to get that, even though it's going to be a snapshot, so it's a single survey, it speaks to the trust literature. It also speaks to securitization in terms of audience acceptance.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's really interesting. So is this kind of, you're mentioning about these different levels of trust, are these kind of what you anticipate to be some of the most interesting findings? Or I guess you're still waiting for the details.
Well, we're still the way we've set up the survey is there are like three schools of trust, basically. As it says, trust in government and bureaucrats is essential. There are people who say trust in doctors and medical providers is essential. Then there's another group that says, no, it's all about the trust in society. And some studies merge maybe two of those, but very rarely do we see a study that actually looks at all three aspects. And certainly no one's done this, as I said, with regard to China. And so we're merging all three aspects. The survey will cover all three different trust domains and then try to work out which is more influential on changing behavior and changing acceptance of new policies and also vaccines as well. And then from that, there is this then theoretical implication going back to securitization. Well, it seemed to be maybe it's trust in the doctors. that's the governing parameter for audience acceptance throughout at least throughout the study. Maybe it's trust in society, maybe it's trust in government. There's a whole literature, particularly coming out of Western scholarship, that says authoritarian governments don't engender trust. But what we see within China is actually a high degree of adherence. So then the other question is, does adherence equal trust? Or is it, as some people have suggested in the media, almost a form of negative trust, that if you don't do this, there's a threat to you in some way? We just don't know. Certainly in the first year and a half almost of the pandemic in China, there was a lot of adherence when there didn't have to be. But there have been some videos circulating recently out of Shanghai and Guangdong that show people running away from alerts that might have them locked down for testing. And that's something we wouldn't have seen, a year ago. So you could possibly infer from that anecdotal evidence and from some statements in Chinese media, and social media in particular, that maybe the trust levels are declining. But does that matter? What's the threshold? What's the extent? These are the sorts of things we're trying to tease out. So it's a fun study. And of course, if we extend it out to Taiwan and Hong Kong later on, we then get into this issue of not culturally dissimilar. It's wrong to say they're culturally similar places, but they're not dissimilar, but very different regime types. And then what influence does regime type have on trust, and therefore, by extension, on acceptance? So, like I say, we're in the final, I'm just sort of going through the final, dotting the I's and crossing the T's with my finance office. And once that happens, we can launch, and that'll be a lot of fun, actually.
Fantastic. Yeah, seems like a very prescient issue, especially with the vaccine disinformation and things like this. So
yeah, absolutely.
I guess shifting now to more kind of your experience, your broader experience in the field of global health. I mean, could you comment on maybe what some of the biggest surprises you've had working in this area, and or maybe some of kind of the biggest myths or disconnects that you found in your work?
There's lots. I think that to start off with, I guess, the biggest myth is that a pandemic like COVID is a biomedical issue. And I think before COVID, there was that myth that, yes, it is purely biomedical. In fact, it's purely public health. And I think what COVID has really opened up people's eyes to is that it's not just about the biomedical side, and it's not just about the public or the human health side. You do have to factor in the role of animals into this, which automatically brings in this One Health perspective. You do have to then focus on the role of the environment, which again is more of a One Health type idea. But then critically, and I think this is coming out more and more as the pandemic goes on, you do have to bring in questions of society, of economic inequality, of basic politics, and almost the philosophical basis in terms of the way the state, in particular territory, is organized, because they have been shown to have such shaping roles. I mean, this is why places like Asia, like Southeast Asia in particular, or Northeast Asia, are really quite fascinating laboratories for a lot of these issues, because you've got a whole range of different societies, you've got a whole range of different cultures, different political systems, different economic systems, and they're all attacking the pandemic in different ways. And it's not just driven by the science. I think what we do see, and I think this is undoubtable, is when the politics and the culture gets too divorced from the science and the biomedical imperatives, then you start to go down a whole lot of rabbit holes. And I think we saw that quite clearly with Donald Trump and his administration's response. We're seeing it at the moment here in Hong Kong with the local government's response to the Omicron outbreak as well. And so I think that's one of the big myths. I think that's where global health really plays an important key role, in sort of highlighting this fact. And I think a lot of us didn't really get a lot of traction on that argument before COVID, because people would often say, no, 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 it's about the medical side, it's about the public health side, and that what you do is good, but it's not necessarily as relevant. I remember I had a grant proposal, which I eventually got, but one year, about sort of 8-9 years ago now, where one of the reviewers said, I was on the topic of Asian diseases in international relations. One of the reviewers said the field of health politics and health security doesn't exist. And I think that's not unrepresentative of a view that was out there. And then I got the grant, and then other things happened. But so I think that that's one area where, one of the big myths has been exploded. I think the other big myth, and this came out of my work with SARS, that I did with Melissa Curley. It came more recently out of my work I did with Catherine Lowe in China on AMR, is that there's an assumption, and this kind of again gets back to the securitization field, but more broadly, there's an assumption that if there's an outbreak, then the responses that the government, the state does to the outbreak are a rational attempt to get the outbreak under control. I mean, it's almost a de facto rationalization within the literature. What I saw firsthand with SARS and what Catherine and I found with AMR is that's not the case. There's a whole lot of different communities. I mean, there could be policy communities, they could be medical communities that try to shape the pandemic or the medical threat for their own ends, for their own purposes. Maybe it's about getting more resources, or maybe it's about more political power. But it's not necessarily about resolving the health threat. And I think that gets back to the fact that different groups within society view existential threats differently, particularly viewing them as non-existential to their particular interests. And once that happens, they are more free to rationalize decisions that might go against the mainstream view in order to build up their own power. We saw it here in SARS, here in Hong Kong with SARS, and also in parts of Southeast Asia as well, when different political groups within societies would use SARS as a way of jockeying for power. Either dominant power groups using it to reinforce political power over their opponents, or having opposition groups politicize the issue beyond what was needed in order to try to sort of gain power. When Catherine and I were in China, doing research there, what we found was that hospitals, which were supposedly sentinel hospitals for diseases, would sometimes hold back tests and results in order to get more resources from the state, either human resources or more equipment or more training, something else. They'd actually use it as bargaining points. And we saw this a little bit. Stefan Elbe did a good paper on this with Indonesia, with Health Minister Supari and her responses with viral sovereignty, where she was holding back critical information the world needed in order to secure political and medical gains. Medical gains for the society, but also domestic political gains as well. And so I think that's one of the biggest myths, that not everyone who says they're here to help is actually here to help in terms of addressing the disease. And I certainly think that with COVID, having that sort of a viewpoint, a more critical viewpoint on people's behavior has been quite helpful, because you stop taking things at face value and you start to ask, why are they doing it? Why are they benefiting? And unfortunately, irrespective of the political system or where it's located in the world, there are definitely lots of examples where people have an eye on what's coming next, or an eye on their own particular political economic circumstance at the moment and are trying to work out how to maximize it. So I think those are the two big myths. I think global health can help with the first one. The second one requires a bit more of an in-depth interrogation as to the motivations behind certain actions that people take.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and I think really reinforces actually the political dimensions of the field, right? That were
absolutely
somewhat doubted at times, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess thinking moving forward then in your research and maybe the way the world is moving forward, what are some of the kind of key, most interesting, high priority issues, I guess, along with your research on trust that you see going forward?
And one of the big questions, I guess, and we saw this quite clearly in the first 6-8 months of the pandemic, is how, I guess for want of a better word, how sexy or how prioritized communicable diseases are, and how we've seen so many billions of dollars devoted to COVID. And yet it's the non-communicable diseases that kill more people, both in developed countries as well as developing countries. In developing countries get the double whammy of both communicable and non-communicable, of course. But we really have neglected the non-communicable side for far too long. It doesn't seem to excite people, and yet it kills more people. And I think going forward, it might not be an area that I'll work on, but I think it's certainly a high priority area for the field. Trying to work out why is it that we have this bias within the field towards communicable diseases. I mean, I was talking with some colleagues, it's fascinating how many COVID experts there are out there all of a sudden who have dropped everything from every walk of life to suddenly focus on COVID. And that's fantastic. I mean, the more people who get involved in this, the better. But it obscures the real need or the real core of the discipline, which is to try to work out ways to make people's lives better. Equally, I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there, and going back to one of my earlier interests, that people are taking a lot more antibiotics during COVID. And I think this is going to be a disaster going forward. I mean, certainly, again, in my part of the world, antibiotic misuse and abuse was already highly rampant. And certainly anecdotal comments and some very preliminary studies out of China, here in Hong Kong and elsewhere in the region, are starting to show that people are taking more antibiotics as a way of staving off the virus. And that's just going to cause a massive problem in a year or two's time. But then I think the other issue, and you briefly sort of touched upon this earlier on, is the issue of misinformation and miscommunication. And I think in this area, there has to be an outreach, not necessarily with the public health people, but with the people in media and communication who have done work in this field for quite a long time. And there's a really solid established field of health communication. But I think there maybe has to be a bit of a merger between health communication and global health, because the role played by social media, the role played by misinformation campaigns, sometimes out of ignorance, but for a lot of the times these days we see either through troublemaking or to advance a political agenda or a social agenda. I do think we need to sort of reach out into those areas a little bit more. And I guess the last thing I'd probably say is that, before COVID broke out, I think it's fair to say there was an entrenched dominant wisdom that mass quarantines didn't work, that mass lockdowns couldn't work. I mean, this debate came up with SARS, it came up with bird flu, it came up with H1N1. I mean, it was even discussed briefly with MERS, although MERS has never been that much of a threat. And the wisdom was, don't do it. It's bad, it won't work, and it's harmful to the economy and harmful to societies. But yet COVID comes along and China does it successfully, and then other countries do it successfully. And I think, for me at least, that raises the question, well, how many other absolutes are there out in the field? which we take as givens, that actually with either COVID or with the next pandemic, we're going to change our thinking on. And I think an interrogation to the those absolute natures of policies and policy decisions and thoughts is quite an important one. And again, I think it might not be something that I'll work on in the future, but having that knowledge as to what can we test before the threat emerges, I think is actually quite an important one.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, you raised a number of really prescient and current issues and really important factors moving forward. So yeah, I'd like to thank you for taking part in the
Thank you
Snapshot
very
podcast.
much, Chris.
Yeah, it's great talking with you. Thank you.
Okay, take good care.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Snapshots podcast. Please see the show notes for more information on our guest.